everyone. Welcome to this session where we will be sharing with you how to identify and grow some of the orchid species and hybrids that are commonly seen in Singapore. I'm Gillian from the Molecular Biology and Micropropagation Labs at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. The labs support the Singapore Botanic Gardens Orchid Hybridization Program and contribute to native plant conservation through research and development.
Hi, I'm Siu Ann, and I take care of orchids at the National Orchid Garden in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Here, we cultivate orchids for display as well as for conserving our native orchids from Singapore and the region.
This webinar is part of the activities we have organized in conjunction with the official opening of the tropical montane Orchidaceae at the National Orchid Garden. If you would like to visit the Orchidaceae, you can find out more about it from our website.
We'll also be having a question and answer session later, so do stay tuned to the end to ask your questions.
So let's start with an introduction to the orchids. The orchid family is known scientifically as the Orchidaceae. It is one of the two largest families of flowering plants in the world, comprising about 25 to 30,000 species spread over every continent except the Antarctic. Orchid species have evolved to fill every environmental niche except the driest deserts and the polar regions. Tropical orchids account for approximately a third of the entire orchid family, so there are about 10,000 species that exist in the tropics.
Now, orchids can grow on many different substrates. Did you know that about 70% of orchids are epiphytes, meaning that they grow on trees? Now, it's important to know that epiphytic orchids are not the same as parasites because they don't draw nutrients from their host trees. They only use the trees for support.
Orchids that grow in the soil are called terrestrials, and those that grow on rocks are called lithophytes. There are also orchids that grow from the ground and require the support of trees, and these are called climbers. Knowing the climatic requirements and substrate preferences of an orchid will help you to choose the right orchid for your home environment and provide it with the correct growing medium.
Next, let's talk about the difference between an orchid species and an orchid hybrid. So Gillian, maybe you can share with us a little bit about the difference between a species and a hybrid?
Orchid species occur naturally in the wild. A species is often defined as a group of organisms capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring and are reproductively isolated from other populations. This means that there are geographic, biological, or genetic barriers that prevent one group of organisms from interbreeding with another group, thus making them distinct species. This Cymbidium finlaysonianum is an example of an orchid species. Orchid species that we purchase from nurseries are likely to have been selected for preferred characteristics and artificially propagated.
Now, in contrast, a hybrid is a product of a cross between two genetically distinct parents. There are different types of hybrids as well. For example, there are primary hybrids, which are created by crossing two different species. Other types of hybrids are a result of crossing a species with a hybrid or a hybrid with a hybrid. Orchids are also quite special because they can be hybridized across different genera in the orchid family. Now, these are known as intergeneric hybrids. Some of these hybrids can have up to 8 different genera in their ancestry.
If you're wondering what the term genera means, it is the plural form of the word genus. A genus is a group of species with sufficient similarity to distinguish it from the next most similar group. So you might have noticed that some orchids have really long names. How do we make sense of them, Siu Ann?
Well, in the orchid world, we have a system of naming orchids, and this is known as orchid nomenclature. We need specific names for orchids in order to accurately specify which particular orchid we're referring to. Now, orchid names consist of 2 parts. For orchid species, the name consists of a genus name and a specific epithet.
For orchid species, take for example, the female parent of our national flower. Its name is Papilionanthe teres. Papilionanthe is the genus name, while teres is the species epithet. When we type out the genus and species names, both should be italicized. If we are writing them out, they should be underlined to indicate that they are Latin names.
Now, for orchid hybrids, Their names consist of a genus name and a Grex name. Our national flower is named Papilionanthe Miss Joachim. The genus name is Papilionanthe, and this should be italicized. The Grex name is Miss Joachim, and this should be unformatted with the first letter of each word capitalized.
Our national flower is an example of a primary interspecies hybrid. Its parents are Papilionanthe teres and Papilionanthe hookeriana. Since both parents belong to the same genus, the hybrid's genus name therefore remains as Papilionanthe.
Now, orchids from different genera can also be crossed to create new hybrids. The names of these hybrids between two genera are always a contraction of two genus names. Take, for example, Arachnis hookeriana and Vanda tricolor. The resulting hybrid is known as Aranda Lucy Laycock. The genus name Aranda is a composite between the two parental genera, Arachnis and Vanda, and would be italicized. The new genus, as a result of the hybridization, is known as a nothogenus. A cross between the genera Aerides, Vanda, and Louisia will give rise to the nothogenus Aeridovanetia.
Hybrids consisting of 3 or more genera can be given a nothogenous name that is not always a composite of the parental genera. This genus name always ends with ara, spelled A-R-A. For example, a hybrid between the genera Arachnis, Trichoglottis, and Vanda is called Ridleyara, named after the first director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, Henry Ridley. A trigeneric hybrid comprising of Arachnis, Rhinanthera, and Vanda is known as Haltamara, named after another director of the Botanic Gardens, Eric Haltam. This is a pentageneric hybrid between Brassavola, Cattleya, Guarianthe, Myrmecophila, and Rhyncholaelia. And it has the genus name Kietanara, named after Dr. Kiet Tan, founding CEO of National Parks Board and Gardens by the Bay.
Now, natural hybrids between two species are sometimes also found in the wild. Once identified and named, the name of these plants usually include a cross between the genus and the species name. Take, for example, Cattleya ex hardiana.
When a man-made orchid hybrid is named, its name has to be registered with the International Orchid Register. A particular parental combination can only have one name, so that even if the same parents are used in a new cross, the resulting hybrid progeny or offspring cannot be given new names. For example, any cross between Papilionanthe teres, Papilionanthe hookeriana, and their varieties or subspecies must be named Papilionanthe Miss Joachim.
However, when certain individuals from a cross or repeated crosses exhibit unique characteristics, they can be given a cultivar name to distinguish them from other progeny from the same parental combination. Species and hybrid plants that are awarded by orchid societies, such as the Orchid Society of Southeast Asia or the American Orchid Society, are usually given a cultivar name. Now, the cultivar name is usually after the species or hybrid name, and it's enclosed in single quotes.
Some unique progeny have arisen from combining different varieties of Papilionanthe teres and Papilionanthe hookeriana. Our national flower has a cultivar name Agnes in recognition of its originator, Miss Agnes Joachim. Other cultivars of Papilionanthe Miss Joachim include Josephine, John Laycock, and this plant over here, which is Papilionanthe Miss Joachim SBG, named for the Singapore Botanic Gardens.
So Gillian, maybe you can share with us what makes an orchid an orchid?
Orchids are angiosperms, which means that they are flowering plants. The angiosperms are divided into two groups, the monocotyledons and the dicotyledons. Orchids belong to the monocotyledonous group, which is the same group that palms and grasses belong to. Most orchids have flowers that are resupinate. That means that their flowers twist 180 degrees as they mature and open. And take, for example, this bud. The spur is at the top when it's immature, and as the flowers open, the spur is now at the bottom.
Now, if you look at an orchid flower, each flower has 3 sepals and 3 petals. One petal is highly modified, and this is known as the labellum or the lip, which you can see in purple color over here. Now, this lip plays a very important role in attracting and guiding pollinators to the reproductive parts of the flower. If you look inside the flower, there are male and female parts that are fused in a structure known as the column. Now, the male part forms the tip of the column and is covered by an anther cap. Under the anther cap are pollinia, which are clumps of pollen grains. The pollinia are connected to a Vegetative, which is a sticky tape that sticks the pollinia to the pollinator's body. The stigma, over here, is also very sticky and can be found just underneath the anther. Now, this sticky substance is where the pollinia will stick to when the insect or pollinator, which is carrying the pollinia, rubs against the stigma.
Common pollinators of tropical orchids include flies, bees, wasps, and moths. Orchids that are pollinated by flies, like this bulbophyllum over here, are usually foul-smelling. Orchids that are pollinated by bees, like this Oncidium, are usually brightly colored. And orchids that are pollinated by moths are usually white or pale colored, like this Brassavola nodosa over here. And if they are fragrant, they are usually fragrant only at night. Only a minority of orchid species actually produce nectar as a reward.
Now, over here, we have a Paphiopedilum, also known as a lady slipper orchid. Pollinators, like hoverflies, are attracted to the color of Paphiopedilum flowers. Now, they usually enter the Paphiopedilum through a large opening in the pouch-shaped lip, and when they enter, they will find no reward because the flower does not produce any nectar. Now, once they're inside, they usually find it very difficult to escape because the inner surface of the lip is slippery. Eventually, they will find a ladder of hairs at the back of the lip that will lead them to the exit. Insects that are the right size will manage to force their way out through the narrow openings at the back and brush against the orchid's column, where the pollen grains are deposited onto the insect's body. This pollen will be delivered to the next flower that the insect falls into.
Now, orchid pollinator relationships are often very specific, and they are the result of millions of years of coevolution. Orchid hybrids, which are artificially produced by humans, do not possess these natural pollinator-orchid relationships and are therefore not reliably pollinated. Some general pollinators might nonetheless effect pollination of these hybrids.
Now, once an orchid flower is pollinated, the ovaries at the base of the pedicel swell and form a seed capsule that I have over here. The pedicel unwinds about 180 degrees as it swells. Now, each seed capsule can contain up to 3 million seeds. Orchid seeds are the smallest seeds in the world, and they lack the necessary nutrients for them to germinate on their own. In the wild, they require the help of symbiotic fungi to germinate. This relationship between fungi and seed is usually very specific. Now, this is why it's difficult for a home grower, maybe like you at home, to germinate your orchid seeds. You may not have the right environment or the right fungus present at home to germinate these seeds. Also, the seeds are so small that they're easily blown or washed away.
In the lab, we use special nutrient media to germinate orchid seeds. Here are some flasks that show seedlings at various stages of growth. This flask has seeds that have been recently sown and have not yet germinated. Once the seeds germinate, they turn green and become photosynthetic. As the seedlings get larger, they require more space, and so they need to be transferred to new flasks with fewer seedlings per flask.
Now, pollination is a method of sexual reproduction, but orchids can also be propagated asexually via vegetative propagation. In order to propagate an orchid vegetatively, first it's important to know the two growth forms. Over here, I have a sympodial orchid, and over here is a monopodial orchid. In the sympodial orchid, the active region of growth is located at the base of each pseudobulb, and the direction of growth tends to be horizontal. Each stem of the pseudobulb of the bulbophylum is known as a pseudobulb, and new pseudobulbs usually emerge from here, as you can see the new growth. The pseudobulbs usually grow to approximately the same height and same size as each other.
This vanda is an example of a monopodial orchid. Monopodials grow indefinitely from the top of the stem and in a vertical direction. They also produce side shoots from growing points along the length of the stem close to the base of each leaf.
Now, if you look over here at this sympodial orchid, now sympodials can be propagated by dividing the clump. First, you need to make sure that there are at least 3 pseudobulbs in a clump that is cut off for propagation. If you look over here at this monopodial, in order to propagate a monopodial successfully, you need to make sure that the monopodial orchid has at least 3 healthy roots. Now, for a demonstration of how to propagate monopodial and sympodial orchids, you can watch the gardening masterclass on growing dendrobiums and vandas in Singapore.
Distinguishing monopodials from sympodials is the first step to identifying an orchid. In this next section, we will help you identify the different types of orchids that are commonly grown in Singapore without going into too much taxonomic detail. By the end of the webinar, you should be able to identify orchids to the genus level or minimally to the next level of classification, which is that of the alliance or subfamily. Do note that the genera we will be introducing might be so large that they span different climatic zones and can comprise species that are epiphytes, lithophytes, and terrestrials. We will be speaking in generalities regarding their preferred habitat, focusing particularly on those that are most relevant to the species and hybrids grown in Singapore.
Now, if you look over here at these orchids in front of me, these belong to the Vanda alliance. They're epiphytes that grow on trees, and they all have the monopodial growth form. Now, it's easy to tell that these are epiphytes because they're not being grown in soil. You would normally see epiphytes growing in a pot with charcoal, mounted on fern bark, on driftwood, or on a tree. So if you see a monopodial epiphyte, you can minimally identify it to the Vanda alliance. Now, species and hybrids of the Vanda alliance produce flowers, spikes that emerge from nodes anywhere along the length of the stem.
The Vanda alliance comprises approximately 158 genera with almost 2,000 species. The alliance includes genera such as Vanda, Rhinanthera, Arachnis, Arides, Trichoglottis, Rhyncholaelia, Arangis, Angraecum, Phalaenopsis, and Papilionanthe.
Now, over here, I've prepared several different orchids with different leaf types. So, Vandaceous species and hybrids typically have 4 different leaf types, although there's a scale of different types. So here we have terete leaf, here is semi-terete, we've got quarter terete, as well as strap leaf. Now, when we look at the plants over here, only Papilionanthe have full terete leaves, meaning that the leaves are pencil-shaped. All the other genera have more strap leaf influence. Now, quarter terete, like this one over here, and semi-terete orchids, they rarely occur in the wild, but they are more common among man-made orchid hybrids. A cross between a strap leaf and a terete leaf produces a hybrid with semi-terete leaves. Now, different crosses between different hybrids of different leaf types will result in different degrees of strap leaf and terete leaf influence.
Orchid enthusiasts tend to be most familiar with Vanda and Phalaenopsis species and hybrids. Some Vandas produce very large flowers. such as this one, and we refer to these as dinner plate vandas. Some produce smaller flowers, like this vanda christensoniana, and this Papilionanda mimipalma, which is fragrant. Phalaenopsis, such as these two, are sometimes referred to as moon orchids or moth orchids. In Mandarin, they are called hu tielan, or butterfly orchids. Phalaenopsis hybrids are commonly sold in supermarkets and flower shops. They are often used to beautify office buildings and shopping malls. They have very large strap leaves, and their flowers can last up to 2 months. Phalaenopsis cornu-cervi, which is this plant, is native to Singapore, and it is one of the species included under our Native Orchid Conservation Program.
Now, if you look over here at this red flower, this is known as a Rhinanthera, which are really easily recognized by the color of their flowers. Most Rhinantheras are bright red, just like this. Now, Rhinantheras are a little bit different from others in the Vanda alliance because their inflorescences are branched, unlike other species or hybrids, which are usually unbranched. Over here, we have Arachnis. Now, Arachnis species and hybrids are quite special and can be identified by their spider-like flowers. Now, since species and hybrids of the Vanda alliance, like Arachnis and Rhinanthera here, are epiphytes, they are usually potted in charcoal or mounted on trees or on wooden fern slabs. Now, many Vandas are able to survive without any potting media, and they can be hung up on a hanging wire just like this. Now, if you hang it up on a hanging wire without any media, you'll probably need to water it a little bit more frequently.
The Vanda alliance also includes 4 genera of leafless orchids. The most commonly seen in Singapore are Cheiloschista and Taeniophyllum. These orchids sometimes produce small leaves which are ephemeral and transient. The roots are green as they contain chlorophyll, and they can photosynthesize in place of the leaves. What I am holding here is a Taeniophyllum pusillum. Look at how cute and tiny its leaves are, its flowers are. This is a Cheiloschista periphyriae. As you can see, it is not currently in flower. Cheiloschistas grow well in partial shade and will thrive if you water them once a day and fertilize them with a low dose of liquid fertilizer once a week. They will need to dry out between watering, so if it rains, you don't need to water it again on the same day.
Now, all of the other orchids that we're going to talk about are sympodials. The most commonly grown epiphytic sympodial orchids in Singapore belong to the Dendrobium genus. There are over 1,800 species in this genus, which are adapted to habitats as diverse as tropical lowlands, montane regions, and even the Australian desert. Now, this genus is divided into 6 sections: Phalaenanthe, Spatulata, Dendrobium, Callista, Latoria, and Formosae. The species that are suitable for growing in Singapore are those that are naturally found in tropical lowlands. These species mainly belong to the Phalaenanthe and Spatulata sections, which have erect pseudobulbs and flower stalks which emerge from the tips or close to the tips of the pseudobulbs. Now, species of other Dendrobium sections tend to prefer cooler climates. Their flowers, leaves, and pseudobulbs also may look quite different.
Dendrobium biggibum belongs to the Phalaenanthe section, and it is commonly used in breeding mini dendrobiums. These are mini dendrobium hybrids. They are very easy to grow and also free flowering. This dendrobium is known as a cane dendrobium, and the cane dendrobiums largely belong to the Spatulata section. They are also known as antelope dendrobiums for their lateral petals, that look like antelope horns. They are commonly hybridized because they are popular for use as cut flowers. They can be crossed with species and hybrids belonging to the Phalaenopsis section to produce progeny with characteristics derived from both sections. The Phalaenopsis section tend to produce flowers which are more rounded, while the Spatulata section tend to produce hardy plants which are free-flowering.
Now, 5 species of Dendrobium are native to Singapore, the most common of which is Dendrobium cruminatum, which is also commonly known as the pigeon orchid. It's commonly seen growing on trees, along roads, and in parks, and maybe your own garden at home. Flowering of these orchids is usually triggered by a drop of at least 6 degrees in temperature, and this usually happens after a few days of consecutive heavy rain. Now you'll see pigeon orchids on trees and along roads flower all at the same time in Singapore, about 9 days after the drop in temperature. The white flowers that you will see on the spikes are very fragrant, but they only last for 1 day.
Bulbophyllum is a genus of epiphytic and lithophytic orchids comprising over 2,000 species. The genus name Bulbophyllum is derived from the Greek words bulbos, meaning bulb, and phyllon, meaning a leaf, referring to the pseudobulbs on top of which the leaf grows. Bulbophyllums can be recognized by their vegetative green parts, so look out for the pseudobulb and the leaf. Most species have relatively fine, fibrous roots, and these help the plants adhere to tree trunks and branches, and they often form large mats over the tree trunks. They flower gregariously, producing large numbers of rather small flowers. Bulbophyllum flowers can vary significantly in size and shape. The flowers usually have a fleshy labellum, and many species produce flowers that smell like rotting meat, as their main pollinators are flies.
Now, there are about 12 species of Bulbophyllum that are native to Singapore. These species are being conserved as part of our native orchid conservation program. You can see Bulbophyllum vaginatum growing and flowering on trees along our roads and in parks. As most of the species are epiphytes, they can be grown in pots with charcoal or mounted on fern bark, just like this one. Sometimes you can also plant it directly onto a tree.
Another group of sympodial epiphytic orchids commonly seen in Singapore is the Oncidium alliance. The Oncidium alliance comprises genera such as Oncidium, Gomesa, Miltonia, Brassia, and Psychopsis. Oncidium flowers are characterized by their large pronounced lips, and these have a callus. The pseudobulbs are often short and bulbous, and sometimes flattened like a disc. Plants belonging to the Oncidium alliance produce flower spikes that emerge from the bases of the pseudobulbs.
Now, most Oncidiums are epiphytic and like to be mounted on wood slabs with a little bit of sphagnum moss or potted in charcoal. Oncidiums like to be watered and moist, but not too waterlogged and soggy. So do make sure that your Oncidium is able to dry out between waterings. As Oncidiums are very diverse and grow in wide range of conditions in the wild, you'll probably need to know what type of Oncidium you have and its preferred growing conditions. Some of the common Oncidiums, like the dancing lady, which you may have at home, prefer to be in bright places and are able to tolerate warm weather and full sun conditions. However, if you're growing something like a Miltonia, it would prefer slightly cooler conditions with bright but indirect sunlight.
You can usually tell how much sun your orchid needs by the thickness and surface area of its leaves. Generally, orchids with thicker leaves and/or a lower surface area can tolerate more sun, while thinner-leaved orchids or those with a higher leaf surface area prefer more shade. However, whether your orchid is sun-loving or shade-loving, it will be shocked if its light conditions are changed too drastically. So never bring orchids from shady conditions to direct sunlight immediately. Orchids should be acclimatized to partial sun conditions before being gradually introduced to places with higher light levels.
Now over here, I have some orchids from the Cattleya Alliance. The Cattleya Alliance is a group of epiphytic sympodial orchids. It comprises genera such as Cattleya, Brassavola, Rhyncholaelia, Laelia, and Sophronitis. Species diversity is centered around South America. The pseudobulbs usually have 1 or 2 leaves, and the flower spikes usually emerge from the tips of the pseudobulbs, as you can see over here. Now this plant, with very large yellow showy flowers, is a trigeneric hybrid between Rhyncholaelia, Laelia, and Cattleya. This is also known as RLC for short, or its full name, Rhyncholaelia. It generally requires a full day of bright indirect light, and it likes to grow in places where its roots get enough aeration.
Brassavolas are easy to grow in our local climate as they have tough leaves that are very tolerant of strong sunlight. Their flowers are usually pale colored, often white and light green. This species over here is Brassavola nodosa, also known as Lady of the Night, as it is fragrant only at night. It is moth-pollinated. Brassavolas are very rewarding to grow because they are very free-flowering and bloom all year round. Their flower spikes usually emerge from the leaf axils, and each flower spike can bear 1 to 6 flowers. They can also put out new growth very frequently and are easy to propagate. You can propagate a Brassavola by cutting the rhizome. This hybrid over here is a cross between Brassavola nodosa and Brassocatleya Richard Mueller. The hybrid is known as Brassocatleya yellowbird. Look at its amazing, attractive yellow flowers.
Now, if you take a look at the orchids in front of me, these are known as epidendrums. Epidendrums are one of the most common and unusual forms of flowers. The flower spikes usually emerge from the tip of stems. Now, these orchids grow very well in Singapore's warm and humid weather. Hybrids of this genus are popular because of their bright and showy flowers.
The Cymbidium alliance comprises genera such as Cymbidium, Grammatophyllum, Catasetum, Cycnoches, Marmodes, and Coryanthes. Many species have roots that form a basket, which functions to collect leaf litter and other detritus which plants use as nutrients. Flower spikes emerge from the bases of the pseudobulbs. This Grammatophyllum speciosum is also known as the tiger orchid. It is native to Singapore and the region and is the largest orchid in the world, being capable of growing to a weight of about 1 ton. When it flowers, the flower stalk can reach up to 3 meters, and each flower measures about 10 centimeters across.
Now over here is a tiger orchid. Tiger orchids are easy to grow at home if you have a large balcony that has full sun, or if your garden is unshaded. Now in the wild, these orchids are epiphytic, and they grow in the crooks of branches. So when you grow them at home, you'll probably want to give them similar conditions. Ideally, you should sit them in a large pot with lots of holes and aeration so that the roots get enough air through them. Now, you must make sure that you don't bury their roots in soil and don't use a moist media like sphagnum moss, because the roots of tiger orchids need to be able to dry out between waterings. You'll want to water them every alternate day, and you can apply some fertilizer to their roots once every 2 weeks so that they get enough nutrients that they need to put out new roots and new growth. Now, these orchids will usually flower when there's hot and dry weather. In June and July, you can try to observe the tiger orchids on roadside trees that usually put out very long spikes with brown and orange spotted flowers. The inflorescences of the tiger orchid are very rewarding and they can last up to 2 months.
These are Cymbidiums. The genus name is derived from the Latin word cymba, meaning cup, bowl, or boat. This is in reference to the boat-shaped labellum that some of the flowers that some species produce. Cymbidiums can be divided into cool and warm growing types. The cool growing types tend to produce larger flowers, and the warm growing types tend to produce smaller flowers. Cymbidium bicolor and this Cymbidium finlaysonianum are native to Singapore, and they are being actively conserved by planting them on trees in our parks and along our roads. They have thick strap-like leaves, and they bear pendulous inflorescences with numerous flowers.
Next, I will like to introduce you to the terrestrial orchids that are commonly grown in Singapore. Now in Singapore, we've got a native climber called Vanilla griffithii. It grows in soil and climbs up trees for support. Now this is closely related to Vanilla planifolia, which I have over here. Now Vanilla planifolia is the source of vanilla flavoring that we use for desserts and perfumes. Although Vanilla planifolia grows very, very well in Singapore, it actually doesn't flower very easily. So we'll recommend that you buy your vanilla beans from the supermarket instead of trying to grow your own.
If you plan to grow vanilla at home, do make sure that you have staking poles or a trellis, as vanilla can grow quite quickly in our warm and humid environment. If given the right conditions, they can grow up to 1 meter a month, so be prepared. Vanilla is relatively hardy and drought tolerant, although it is still best to water it every day. So if you give it a good watering and then go on holiday for a few days, it is likely to still be in good condition when you return.
Now, all the other terrestrial orchids that we're going to tell you about are sympodial in its growth form. Over here, I have Spathoglottis, which is another orchid that can be commonly found in parks and gardens around Singapore. Now, the name Spathoglottis comes from the Greek words spathe and glotta, meaning blade tongue. Now, it gets its name because of its lip in the flower is usually pointed and looks very much like a blade. Spathoglottis also have pleated leaves and multiple flowers per stalk. Over here is Spathoglottis plicata, which is native to Singapore. It was the first orchid species that was used to create an orchid hybrid by Professor Eric Holtham in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. And this sparked Singapore's journey to become one of the world's leading centers for orchid hybridization.
You can easily grow Spathoglottis in a pot on your balcony, as it will thrive in partial sun conditions. If you take a closer look at a Spathoglottis, you will see a very crowded bunch of pseudobulbs. Unlike dendrobiums that grow with their pseudobulbs exposed and their roots covered with porous media such as charcoal, Spathoglottis like to grow with the pseudobulbs covered in soil. Use a good quality potting soil that is mixed with perlite or sand so that the media is able to drain, and also to partially cover the pseudobulbs.
Now, if you look over here, we have some Arundina. Arundina species and hybrids are also commonly used in landscaping. Now, plants of this genus are known as bamboo orchids. Now, they're easy to identify because they look like miniature bamboos, which have bright pink flowers that grow from upright stalks from the top of the plant. Now, Arundina graminefolia is native to Singapore and grows in moist forests. Now, the first Arundina hybrid was produced by the late Mr. David Lim, an orchid breeder at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. This was a cross between Arundina graminefolia and Arundina cespitosa. The hybrid was registered in the International Orchid Register in 2011. However, since then, Arundina cespitosa has been recategorized as Arundina graminefolia, and the hybrid is now considered a cultivar of Arundina graminefolia.
Bamboo orchids are quite easy to grow, but they need to be watered regularly. They are also very easy to propagate. Take a look at this plant. It has keikis or side shoots emerging from the stem of the mother plant. These can be removed from the mother plant and repotted.
Now over here we have Bromhedia. Bromhedia, very similar to Arundina, they can grow quite tall. Now Bromhedia are commonly referred to as reed orchids because of the leaves and their stems. Now they usually produce large white flowers, and in the wild you'll find them growing along rivers and swamps. So if you grow Bromhedia at home, you'll probably want to keep their soil quite moist. Now, like Arundina, the flowers usually appear in succession near the end of the flowering stem. Over here, you'll see the pot. You'll want to sort of grow your Bromhedia in a pot which is slightly larger, as they produce new stems from the side. So you'll need to give them enough space to grow.
Have you heard of jewel orchids? Not all orchids are grown for their flowers. These are jewel orchids, and they are grown for their beautiful leaves, which look velvety and have iridescent veins. They produce rather unremarkable small flowers borne on flower stalks that emerge from the tips of the stems. The most common types of jewel orchids that you'll be able to find in Singapore are Ludicea discolor and Macodes petala. What I have here is Ludicea discolor. If you are curious about how Macodes petala looks like, here is a photo that you can have a closer look at. It has very attractive venation. Now, this plant is sensitive to heat and also direct sunlight, and the roots need to be kept moist but not waterlogged.
Now, if you're a beginner grower, I would recommend you start with Ludicea discolor because it's a little bit more resilient. It likes a cool and humid environment with bright but not direct sunlight. Now, if you look over here, we've used leaf litter because the jewel orchid usually grows on forest floors where there is a lot of moisture and leaf litter that covers the stems. They'll need to be fertilized, but they're quite sensitive, so make sure you use a low dosage, maybe half or a quarter of the recommended amount.
Paphiopedilums belong to the subfamily Cypripedioideae, along with 4 other genera: Cypripedium, Maxipedium, Phragmipedium, and Phalaenopedium. The Cypripedioids are commonly known as slipper orchids because they are easily identified by their pouch-shaped lips, which look like a lady slipper. They have prominent dorsal sepals, and their lateral sepals are fused into a single structure called the synsepal. Flower stalks emerge from the top of the plant, from the tips of the stems. Most Paphiopedilum species are terrestrials or lithophytes, the latter meaning that they grow on rocks. Only a handful of species are epiphytes. Paphiopedilum is the only genus of slipper orchids which has species and hybrids that are suitable for growing in our local climate. All other Cypripedioid genera require cooler climates.
Now, Paphiopedilums grow best in a well-draining mix of compost, soil, charcoal chips, and sand. They usually don't do very well in full sun, so you'll need to use a shade net if you're putting it on a sunny balcony. They also need an environment with higher humidity.
Wow, Siu Ann, it looks like we've covered a lot of ground today. We hope that you now have a better understanding of orchid nomenclature, their anatomy, growth forms, and the various types of orchids that can be found in Singapore. It is time now for us to answer your questions. So please submit your questions by clicking on the question and answer icon on your screen. If you see that someone else has asked what you already had in mind, you can also upvote that question by clicking on the thumbs up icon.
Hi, welcome back. So we've got lots of good questions from our viewers. And the first question that we'll be taking is from Hazri Boi. And he asks, what are the common orchids that you can grow in high-rise apartments or common corridors, especially ones that are able to take low light? Thanks, Hazri, for your question. So typically when we talk about high-rise apartments, and normally those that are very hardy and easy to grow, we usually start by recommending mini dendrobiums like this one. However, mini dendrobiums do need a little bit more light. And I think you mentioned that your balcony or your corridor might be slightly lower light conditions. If you have a balcony with lower light conditions, you could try growing a Phalaenopsis like this one. So this is a novelty Phalaenopsis, and they're able to be adapted to lower light conditions. So yeah, you can try that.
We have a question from Seng Liak Nguang. Thank you so much for your question. And the question is, how often do we need to apply fertilizer to orchids? Do we spray on the leaf or root? So we have a dictum, and that is to fertilize your orchids weekly, as in W-E-E-K-L-Y, and weekly, as in W-E-A-K-L-Y. You don't want to dump too much fertilizer on your orchids at one shot and then not fertilize them for another year and then dump a whole lot of fertilizer again. So you want to keep a consistent level of fertilization. You should use a fertilizer that's balanced between the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then you can alternate it with fertilizers that have a higher potassium and phosphorus level to try to encourage flowering. Now, whether or not you should spray it on the leaf or root, you can actually spray it on the whole plant, and that's fine. Just make sure that for plants that are like the Phalaenopsis, that you don't get the liquid collecting between the leaves, because this is where the growing point is, and when the growing point rots, that will surely kill your plant.
Okay, and for the next question, we've got a question from FL. Thank you for your question. It's, what is the ideal environment for orchids to thrive? Shady, outdoors, and frequent watering? Is charcoal the ideal nutrient? So let's start with the environment. As we mentioned before, orchids can grow in a wide variety of habitats. Some grow in deep shade. For example, jewel orchids, they need more shade. Or if you have oncidiums, like at home you may have the dancing lady, those would prefer brighter conditions. So you do need to know what orchid you have. Is charcoal the ideal media? As we mentioned before, you also need to know your orchid's growth form. For example, dendrobiums and vandas typically are okay to grow in charcoal. However, if you're growing maybe something like a Paphiopedilum, you may want something which is able to retain more moisture. That's why you would add some like bark or mix a little bit of sphagnum moss inside. So it depends on how dry or how wet the individual orchid likes it.
Benedict Chong has a question, and it is, Phalaenopsis orchids that we buy from nurseries often come from Taiwan and China, which have a more temperate climate. Do they need to be acclimatized to bloom in Singapore's warm tropical weather? And how do we acclimatize them? Actually, that's a really good question, which shows that it's actually important to know where your orchids come from. If you're buying orchids from countries with very different climates, it is unlikely that they will be able to grow well in Singapore. So you're right, Phalaenopsis do largely come from Taiwan. These are really beautiful, attractive ones, and a lot of people like to buy these because their blooms last for 2 months. And in fact, a lot of people just throw out the plant the moment the blooms fade off because it's not that easy to reflower again. So I would say that generally Phalaenopsis, like these kinds, tend to flower only once, maximum twice a year. They won't give you flowers 5 times a year. And they require cool weather in order to reflower. So it is possible for it to reflower in Singapore, especially after a cool December period. But as you can see from their leaves, they have a very large surface area. So make sure that you don't put Phalaenopsis in direct sunlight. They need to be in shaded areas.
Okay, and for our next question, we've got a question from Li Xian-Chin. Thank you for your question. So the question is, how do I encourage the orchid to flower after each flowering period? How long do I need to wait for the next flowering? So in order to encourage your orchid to flower, you need to make sure that it's growing healthily in the first place. So when it's without its flower, you need to make sure that you keep its leaves looking healthy. You need to water them regularly, give them enough sunlight. Okay, so you need to monitor how well your orchid is growing. Then after that, you need to start to feed your orchid, because in order for the orchid to put out new flowers, they do need certain nutrients. So do use a fertilizer for orchids.
Robert San Gabriel asked a very interesting question, one that I've never gotten before. Is SBG offering training for seed pod processing or plant tissue culture? And if not, are there any entities offering this kind of training? So yeah, unfortunately, SBG does not offer training for seed pod germination. We do take in interns from our polytechnics or universities, but unfortunately, we don't provide training for the general public because it is a process which requires a lot of equipment, and it's going to be rather difficult for you to do it at home. You have to provide a sterile environment because the media that we use for germinating seed pods, they are very rich in nutrients. And these nutrients, if there are any contaminants like bacteria and fungi, they can use up these nutrients and grow much faster than your orchids. So for example, in the lab, to get from seed to the end stage where the plants are about 8 centimeters in height, it takes between 1 to 2 years, and certainly bacteria and fungi grow much faster than that. Orchids are not in any hurry to grow. So you need to ensure that everything is kept sterile. If you want to do it at home, you have to buy plant tissue culture media. You need a pressure cooker to sterilize your equipment and media. And you also need some sort of sterile cabinet. It can be a fish tank, a glass fish tank that's with the opening facing you. And then you need an alcohol lamp in there. You need to wipe it down to keep it really as clean as possible. And you have to be able to do your manipulations in that sterile environment as close to the flame as possible. So it's not an easy skill to build up, and certainly it's not easy to get together all the equipment and the media that you require. So sorry, I can't give you any recommendations for other entities that might provide these services.
Okay, the next question that we have is from Jarius Wong. And he asks, when an orchid outgrows a pot, what's the best way to repot the orchid without hurting the roots and the shoots? So sometimes if you have a clay pot like this and you don't want to break the roots, instead you can actually just break the pot. So clay pots, you can just take a hammer or maybe a heavy object and break the pot, and then the root ball should be intact. And you can just transplant your whole root ball into the next pot. Now, if you have maybe a pot which is plastic, which you can't just break open so easily, you can try to squeeze the sides to release the roots from the sides of the pot, and then you can try to pull out the whole root ball as a whole. You might also want to check when you remove it to check the roots for its health, because if the roots are not healthy, it's actually good to remove it and not keep it in the next pot, because you'll be bringing the root disease to the next pot as well.
Jarius Wong has excuse me. I'll answer a question from Frankie. Does the National Orchid Garden sell your hybrids to the public? Unfortunately, we don't, particularly for our VIP orchid hybrids, which are named after dignitaries and VIPs, because We want to keep them special, and you can come to the National Orchid Garden to look at these plants. We do have shops in the Botanic Gardens that do sell some of the orchid hybrids that are commonly seen in Singapore, but not SPG's VIP hybrids.
Okay, and we've got another question from Samuel Chua, and he asks, what other orchids can grow in soil like the Spathoglottis? So as we mentioned before, we've got Spathoglottis grows in soil. Over here we have Bromhedia. Bromhedia also grows in soil. There's also Arundina, the bamboo orchid, which can grow in soil as well. And there are, those are the most common terrestrial orchids that you can find in Singapore. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to a question from Jarius Wong. During Chinese New Year, local nurseries will sell big flowered Cymbidiums, which I understand are cool growing. Will they be able to grow well or even reflower in our climate? I love those Cymbidiums as well, and unfortunately, they do not grow well in our climate. It is best that you look for Cymbidiums that are more suited to tropical weather. For example, this very special Cymbidium Black Magic. They have smaller flowers, admittedly, but you should have less problems growing them in Singapore than a cool-growing Cymbidium.
Okay, and the next question is from Samuel Chua, and he asks, when propagating, what should we take note of, such as water or fertilizer and light? Some keikis die faster when detaching from the parent plants. I think so. One of the things you need to look for when you're looking for keikis are roots. So if you can see this one over here. So of course, if the keiki has produced more roots, the rate of survival is higher because the keiki is able to draw its water and its nutrients on its own. So you will want to look for keikis that have more roots, okay? And not only that, once you detach it, it no longer has the regular water supply from its mother plant. So of course, keikis will need to be watered regularly, at least once a day. And you may want to use a media that is able to retain more water at the start.
We have a question from Hui Lan, and it is, what should I look for when buying an orchid? When you go to a nursery, you should certainly take note of the conditions under which the orchids are growing. Are they under shade cloth or are they exposed to full sun? That might give you an indication of the light requirements of that orchid. And then you have to consider whether your home has the same light conditions as what is provided in the nursery. In addition, you should look out for plants that are healthy and without pests, which means that the leaves are a nice green and they don't have too many black spots on them. A few spots will be fine. And if you want to ensure that you're buying a hybrid that is free flowering, what you look for are the old flower stalks on the stem. And you can see that this particular pseudobulb has at least 3 or 4 old flower stalks. And you can see 4 flower stalks on this, 3 old ones and 1 new one, which means that every pseudobulb will give you about 4 flower stalks, and that's a very free-flowering hybrid. So do look out for the old flower stalks.
Okay, this is, I'll be taking the last question as we're coming to the end of our webinar. So the last question is from Pearl Kwok, and she asks, what is the appropriate potting media for jewel orchid Macodis petiolata? So Macodis generally, they prefer moist media like sphagnum moss. And you would want to keep the sphagnum moss moist, but not soaking wet in like waterlogged. You could also mix it with some charcoal or bark chips and some perlite or pumice chips to add some porosity to the media. So thank you for all of your questions.
That's all the time now that we have for the webinar today. Thank you for tuning in and for submitting your questions. We hope that this webinar has helped you better identify and grow the different types of orchids that we commonly see in Singapore. Before we end, do scan the QR code shown on your screen to provide us with your feedback.
Now, once again, this online webinar is part of the activities for the opening of the Tropical Montane Orchidaceae in the National Orchid Garden. If you'd like to visit the Orchidaceae, safe management measures are in place for the safety and well-being of all our visitors. This includes temporary closures when maximum capacity is reached. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.